Imagine a Tuesday morning in Midtown Manhattan. The sky is normal. The traffic is normal. People are buying coffee, arguing with cabs, staring at phones, doing everything ordinary people do when they have no idea the world is about to be rearranged. Then something enters the atmosphere at a speed that radar systems register for exactly 0.3 seconds before it becomes irrelevant. There is no warning siren. There is no broadcast interrupt. There is simply a sound, a single compressed boom, like every thunderstorm that ever existed, deciding to happen at once, and then a crater where the corner of 5th Avenue and 47th Street used to be. The shockwave alone shatters windows in a 12-block radius, flips 4 yellow cabs, and knocks a news helicopter sideways hard enough that the pilot will later describe it as being swatted by God. Emergency services scramble. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s passive monitoring array lights up like a Christmas tree. The Avengers, mid-debrief at the tower, feel the whole building vibrate. Tony Stark pulls up satellite imaging and sees a roughly human-shaped object standing at the center of a perfectly circular impact zone, hands in his pockets, looking mildly confused. Not aggressive, not posturing, just standing there, looking around like someone who stepped off the wrong train and isn't quite sure which borough they landed in. And that casual stillness at the center of catastrophic arrival is the first thing that tells everyone paying attention that they are not looking at a threat they have a name for. They're not looking at anything they've seen before. And whatever this is, it is only just beginning. If you're watching this and something in your gut just shifted, good. Subscribe and keep that feeling close, because what Saitama does to the Marvel Universe in the next 12 parts doesn't just escalate. It dismantles. You've been warned. The crater was 40 feet wide and perfectly circular, which was the first thing that didn't make sense. Impacts from orbital debris, experimental weapons, even enhanced individuals hitting the ground at terminal velocity, they all left irregular damage patterns, asymmetrical gouges, directional spray, the kind of chaotic physics that happens when something with mass meets something with resistance. This crater had none of that. The edges were clean. The depth was uniform. The concrete beneath it hadn't cracked outward, it had compressed downward, as if the ground itself had simply accepted what landed on it and chosen not to argue. Whatever came down had not crashed. It had arrived. Tony Stark was looking at the satellite feed from the tower's top floor, while Natasha stood beside him saying nothing, which was her way of saying quite a lot. Steve Rogers had his arms crossed and was studying the figure at the crater's center, with the particular stillness he reserved for things he hadn't encountered in any briefing file. The figure was approximately 5'9", wearing a plain white tracksuit with a yellow cape that had seen better days, and was currently rotating slowly on one heel as if trying to orient himself by landmarks. He looked up at the skyline. He looked down at his feet. He looked at the smoking ring of displaced concrete around him and seemed only mildly inconvenienced by it, the way a man might be mildly inconvenienced by stepping into a puddle he hadn't noticed. Then he scratched the back of his bald head and sighed, audibly enough that the S.H.I.E.L.D. mic drone hovering at 300 feet caught it clearly. The sigh was not dramatic. It was the sigh of someone whose commute had gone slightly wrong. "He's not moving aggressively," Natasha said finally. "He's not scanning for targets. He's not signaling." Tony pulled up the atmospheric entry data, cross-referenced it with impact force calculation, and then sat very still for a moment. "He hit the ground at somewhere between Mach 15 and Mach 17, he said slowly, "and he's standing there sighing." The first responders who reached the crater perimeter were NYPD, because NYPD always gets there first even when they absolutely should not. 2 officers approached the figure with hands raised, voices professional and careful, asking him to identify himself and remain stationary. The figure looked at them the way you might look at someone who just asked you to hold still while they take a photo, not threatened, not annoyed, just faintly puzzled by the formality of it. He said his name was Saitama. He said he wasn't sure where he was exactly, because where he came from looked different. He said he was sorry about the road, gesturing vaguely at the crater, and his tone was completely sincere in the way that made it somehow worse, because sincerity implied he hadn't even been trying. The Quinjet arrived 6 minutes later. Steve Rogers descended the ramp in full gear, which Saitama looked at with mild curiosity, the shield especially, tilting his head at it the way someone might appreciate a retro design choice. Steve introduced himself. He used his name, not his title, which was the approach he'd learned worked best when you genuinely didn't know if the person you were talking to was a threat or a lost civilian or something operating outside both those categories entirely. Saitama nodded. He said the name sounded familiar in a vague way. He could not explain how he had arrived. He did not know what SHIELD was. He was not hostile. He was also, Steve would later report, the most completely unreadable person he had ever attempted to assess, because there was simply nothing radiating off him, no fear, no aggression, no calculation, no performance. Just a man standing in a crater he made, mildly curious about his surroundings. And then the wrecking crew showed up. They had been mid-robbery 6 blocks north when the impact hit and had decided, with the particular logic of career criminals who have operated in a world full of superhumans long enough to feel bold about it, that the chaos was covered. Thunderball led them south down 5th Avenue at full charge, wrecking ball swinging, Wrecker right behind him with the enchanted crowbar crackling with Asgardian energy residue. They had leveled 3 city blocks between them on their worst day. They were not quiet about their arrival. Thunderball announced his presence by putting the wrecking ball through the side of a parked National Guard truck at the crater perimeter and roaring something about nobody being in his way. Saitama turned around. He looked at Thunderball the way you look at someone who started talking loudly at a restaurant and interrupted a conversation you were barely invested in to begin with. Not alarmed, not readying himself, just turning around and looking. Thunderball launched the wrecking ball directly at him, a full-force throw that had previously caved in the hull of a Stark Industries armored transport, and Saitama caught it with one hand without adjusting his stance. The chain went taut. Thunderball's arm jerked forward from the recoil of something stopping his throw dead. The ball itself had a handprint pressed into its surface where Saitama's fingers had gripped it, the steel deformed like putty. Steve Rogers reached for his comm. Tony was already on the line. Neither of them said anything for a full 3 seconds. Saitama set the wrecking ball down gently, almost politely, and looked at Thunderball with a faint expression that might have been pity, or boredom, or some combination of the two that the English language doesn't have a clean word for. Thunderball stared at the handprint in his wrecking ball. The wrecker had stopped running. The crowd that had been filming on phones went completely silent in the way that crowds only go silent when something has happened that their brains haven't caught up to yet. And in that silence, in that single frozen moment between the catch and whatever came next, every camera in Midtown Manhattan was pointed at one bald man in a yellow cape who looked, above all else, like he was waiting to see if there was going to be more to this. There was not going to be more to this. The footage was everywhere within 11 minutes. Not just social media, every major news network had at least 3 angles of it, because Midtown Manhattan on a Tuesday morning is arguably the most surveilled square mile on the planet, and every camera in a 12-block radius had been pointed at the crater since the boom. The clip that spread fastest wasn't even the catch. It was the 10 seconds after it, Saitama setting the wrecking ball down with the careful deliberateness of someone returning a borrowed item, the wrecking crew standing completely motionless, and then Thunderball, a man who had traded blows with Thor and walked away grinning, slowly backing up 1 step. That single step, that involuntary, instinctive retreat from a bald man in a tracksuit who hadn't even raised his voice, that was the clip. That was the one that got 90 million views before sundown and started a conversation that would not stop for a very long time. Tony Stark watched it 4 times in a row on his way down to the crater in the Quinjet, each time advancing frame by frame through the catch sequence and running the force calculations again, because the first 3 results had come back as physically implausible, and he kept expecting the number to change. It did not change. Whatever Saitama had absorbed in that single-handed stop, the kinetic output of Thunderball's full-force throw, a man whose baseline strength had been measured at class 70 on their existing scale, had registered on the suit's external sensors as a localized force event that should have sent shockwaves through the surrounding block. Should have. The shockwaves had stopped at Saitama's palm. The energy had simply gone nowhere because the hand holding the ball had not moved, not a millimeter. Tony had a word for what he was looking at in those calculations, and the word was wrong, because the word implied the physics were broken, and Tony Stark had built his entire worldview on the premise that physics were not broken. They were just sometimes surprising. He landed the suit 20 feet from Saitama and came out of it with his faceplate up, which was a deliberate choice. Open body language, no weapons facing forward, the same tactical consideration he'd seen Steve use and had grudgingly admitted worked better than showing up fully armed when the situation was ambiguous. Saitama looked at the suit with slightly more interest than he'd shown the wrecking crew, which Tony chose to take as a compliment. Steve was already there, and so was Natasha, who had descended from the Quinjet in full gear and positioned herself at a precise angle that gave her sight lines in 4 directions while appearing to simply be standing there. Thor had arrived separately, because Thor arrived to everything separately, usually from directly above. He dropped from cloud level and landed 10 feet to Saitama's left with the particular thunderous gravity of someone who had never once in his life considered a quieter entrance. Mjolnir crackled with residual lightning. Saitama looked at the hammer and then at Thor and said, genuinely, that it was a nice hammer. Thor, who was prepared for many responses to his arrival, had not been prepared for that one. The wrecking crew had been restrained and were now sitting against a concrete barrier under Natasha's watchful eye. Thunderball still staring at the handprint in his wrecking ball with an expression that had passed through disbelief and come out the other side into something quieter and more permanent. The wrecker had not said a word since the catch. Piledriver had asked once, very quietly, if they could be taken in now, which under normal circumstances would have been the funniest thing any of them had ever said, but under current circumstances, was simply a man expressing a preference to be somewhere that was not here. Tony opened with the direct approach, because he had tried the indirect approach at various points in his life, and found it slower without being meaningfully more effective. He told Saitama his name, acknowledged that Saitama had already given his, and then asked plainly, without framing it as an accusation, how exactly a human-appearing individual had entered the atmosphere at hypersonic velocity and walked away from a 40-foot impact crater without a scratch, a broken bone, or even scuffed shoes. Saitama listened to all of this patiently. Then he said he trained a lot. Tony waited for more. More did not come. He said, trained how? Saitama said, 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, 10 kilometers of running, every day for 3 years, no air conditioning. He said it the way someone describes a commute, factual, slightly tired of explaining it, not trying to impress anyone. Tony's left eye twitched. Bruce Banner, patched in remotely from the tower because everyone had agreed it was better to keep Bruce remote until the threat level was clearer, made a sound over the comm that was not quite a laugh and not quite despair. Thor stepped forward then, because Thor processed uncertainty through action in a way the others had all individually learned to work around rather than fight. He said that he recognized no realm this man hailed from, no energy signature, no bloodline of any enhanced lineage in the 9 realms or beyond, and that this was itself remarkable. He said it with the weight of someone who had met nearly everything that existed and was now encountering a gap in his own comprehensive experience. Saitama listened to this too, and then asked if that meant he'd met a lot of strong people. Thor said yes, many, across centuries and galaxies. Saitama nodded slowly, and for just a moment something crossed his face, not excitement, not challenge-seeking energy, but something older and quieter, like the expression of a man who has been hopping to find a specific thing for a very long time and isn't sure yet if he's found it. Then it was gone, replaced by the baseline mild blankness, and he asked if there was somewhere nearby he could get something to eat because the travel had been disorienting. SHIELD Director Fury arrived on scene 12 minutes later and spent 45 seconds reviewing the catch footage on his phone before snapping it shut and looking at the 5 assembled Avengers with the expression he reserved for situations where the threat assessment model he had spent 30 years refining had just become partially obsolete. He had classifications for enhanced humans. He had classifications for alien threats. He had classifications for reality-altering events and rogue AI and ancient mythological entities walking around in contemporary clothes. What he did not have was a classification for a bald man in a tracksuit who caught Class 70 Force events one-handed and was currently asking Steve Rogers if the shawarma place Tony had mentioned after the Battle of New York was still open. He told his team to begin a Level 6 assessment protocol. He told them quietly, stepping away, so that Saitama would not hear the classification. Level 6 was the one they used for things that could theoretically end civilization. They had never actually deployed it for a single individual before. On the other side of the crater, Saitama had agreed to accompany the Avengers to the tower for what Steve had carefully described as a conversation, and a meal in that order, meal first if Saitama preferred. Saitama said the meal first was fine. He seemed genuinely pleased about this in a way he had not seemed genuinely pleased about anything else since arriving. Not the crater, not the wrecking crew, not Thor's hammer or Tony's suit or Fury's trench coat. Just the prospect of food. And as the group moved toward the Quinjet, as the cameras kept rolling and the feeds kept streaming and the government lines started lighting up across 3 different agencies simultaneously, Nick Fury stood at the crater's edge and looked at the clean compressed circle in the concrete and thought about the word that Tony's impact calculations had returned and decided that whatever came next was going to require a completely different kind of thinking than anything they had done before. The kind of thinking you do when the scale has changed and you don't yet know by how much. The meal was shawarma. Saitama ate 3 portions without comment and would have eaten a 4th if Tony hadn't been watching with the focused attention of a man trying to extract data from an observable phenomenon, which made the whole thing feel like a lab setting, and Saitama, to his credit, seemed to notice this and find it mildly annoying in the way he found most things mildly annoying. He ate. The Avengers sat around the table in various states of strategic casualness, which is the particular body language of trained operatives trying to appear relaxed while running continuous threat assessment on the person across from them. Saitama did not appear to run any assessment on them at all. He finished his food, pushed the container to the side, and asked if there was more. There was more. He ate that too. The debrief that followed was the most technically strange conversation any of them had been part of, including the one where Thor had explained the 9 realms using a napkin diagram and a salt shaker. Saitama answered every question they asked him directly and without evasion, which should have made him easier to understand and somehow made him harder. He confirmed that he had entered this world from another, not a realm, not a parallel dimension in any framework they had terminology for, simply somewhere else that operated by rules similar enough to be recognizable and different enough that he wasn't sure how the transition had happened or how to reverse it. He said he had been in the middle of a fight. He used the word fight the way most people use the word errand, as a neutral logistical descriptor, when something had gone wrong with the impact and he had ended up here. He did not know what had gone wrong. He did not seem particularly distressed about it. When Tony asked him if he wanted to get back, Saitama paused for a long moment and said he supposed so, eventually, though his tone suggested the timeline eventually was flexible. Bruce Banner had rejoined them by then in person, because the preliminary biometric data coming off Saitama's passive scan, the kind SHIELD ran on everyone who came through the tower without their knowledge, because SHIELD ran those on everyone, had produced results that Bruce needed to see with his own eyes rather than through a screen. He sat down across from Saitama with his tablet and pulled up the readings with the professional composure he maintained whenever the numbers were doing something that made his hands want to shake. The data showed standard human biology in every measurable category. Organ function normal, brain activity is normal, cellular structure unremarkable. The only anomaly was a complete absence of any detectable energy signature. No gamma radiation, no cosmic energy absorption, no Asgardian bioelectric field, no extremis traces, no quantum fluctuation, nothing. Saitama was, by every instrument Bruce had available, a completely ordinary human being. Bruce explained this finding to the room and then added, quietly but clearly, that this was obviously impossible given what they had observed, and that the most likely explanation was not that Saitama was ordinary, but that whatever he was ran on a mechanism that their instruments had no framework to detect, which was a scientific way of saying they were looking at something they did not have the right tools to see yet. Saitama listened to this summary and said which was not a response any of them had been expecting. While this was happening in the tower, 3 other conversations were occurring simultaneously in locations that would shape everything that followed, which is how the world actually works. Not in single rooms but in parallel, in offices and situation rooms and boardrooms where different kinds of power were processing the same information through completely different filters. The first conversation was in the Pentagon, where a joint task force had been assembled within 2 hours of the impact and was currently reviewing the catch footage alongside S.H.I.E.L.D.'s preliminary assessment and arriving at the unanimous conclusion that Nick Fury needed to be on a secure line within the hour. The second conversation was at the United Nations, where 3 member nations had already formally requested a briefing on the unidentified enhanced individual, whose arrival had been broadcast globally, and whose power profile did not match any existing classification, which was diplomatically neutral language for we are concerned and need to understand if this is your asset or someone else's problem. The third conversation, the one that would matter most in the weeks ahead, was in a glass-walled conference room in Avengers Tower's secure sublevel, where Fury sat across from Maria Hill, and a man named Thaddeus Ross who had driven from Washington that morning, and whose presence at the table told Fury everything he needed to know about how quickly this had escalated through channels he hadn't fully anticipated. Ross had a file. The file was thin because it had been assembled in under 4 hours, but what it contained was sharp and pointed in the way that Ross's thinking always was, stripped of anything that wasn't tactically relevant, focused entirely on the question of what this individual represented as a strategic variable, and what options existed for managing that variable before it managed them. He did not use words like threat or weapon. He used words like asset and liability and containment window, which were cleaner words that meant the same things with the serial numbers filed off. He said that the individual currently eating shawarma 12 floors above them represented an unprecedented unclassified power event, and that the standard operating procedure for unclassified power events was assessment followed by integration or isolation, and that the window for managing either of those outcomes was narrowing with every news cycle. Fury listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he said that the footage of the wrecking ball catch had 90 million views and climbing, and that the integration or isolation conversation was already happening in the court of public opinion, whether Ross wanted it to or not, and that the window Ross was describing had been open for approximately 45 minutes after impact and was now functionally closed. What nobody in that room had accounted for, what none of the 3 simultaneous conversations had accounted for, was that Saitama was not listening to any of this. Not because he was unaware that conversations about him were happening, but because he simply was not the kind of person who oriented his existence around how other people were categorizing him. He had finished eating. He had answered the questions he was asked. He had looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline with the expression of someone who found it adequately interesting without finding it remarkable, which from a man who had presumably seen extraordinary things in his own world was itself a data point None of them had processed yet. He had asked Steve, with complete sincerity, if there was anywhere good to do grocery shopping nearby, because his supply situation was unclear given the dimensional displacement, and he didn't like going more than 2 days without proper food. Steve had said he'd figure something out. Saitama nodded and looked back out the window. And 12 floors below, Ross was sketching a containment protocol on a yellow legal pad that assumed the subject could be managed by institutional force if the situation required it, which was the assumption that was going to cost them more than any single decision made in the days that followed, because it was built on a model of power that Saitama had already made obsolete the moment he caught that wrecking ball without moving his feet. The incident that broke containment didn't come from Saitama. That was the part that made it complicated, because every protocol Ross had sketched and every conversation Fury had managed had been built around the assumption that the next escalation would originate with the unknown variable. That Saitama would do something, push somewhere, test a boundary in a way that gave them a defined response opportunity. What actually happened was that the city broke open on its own schedule entirely, the way New York City has always had a talent for doing, which is loudly and without regard for anyone's existing contingency planning. The Absorbing Man and Titania, Carl Creel and Mary McFerrin, two of the most structurally destructive enhanced individuals in the existing SHIELD threat registry, had been sitting on a contract job in Brooklyn for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment to move a stolen Stark Industries power cell across the bridge. The chaos of Saitama's arrival, the media saturation, the emergency service redeployment toward Midtown, all of it created a window they decided to use. They moved through Lower Manhattan with the particular confidence of people who have been in enough fights with enough Avengers to have developed a working sense of what they could absorb and what they needed to avoid. They leveled 2 NYPD barricades, collapsed a parking structure that was unfortunately occupied, and were moving north on Broadway when they crossed into the zone where Saitama happened to be. Happened is the right word. Saitama had asked Steve about grocery shopping, and Steve, in good faith, had pointed him toward a market 11 blocks from the tower and given him a SHIELD emergency contact card in case anything came up. This was a reasonable decision by any normal standard of assessment and an almost cosmically poor one by the standard of what actually occurred, because Saitama had been standing in the produce section of a grocery store on Broadway, examining a melon with the focused concentration he brought to all domestic tasks, when the wall came in. Not metaphorically, literally. Titania hit the exterior wall of the building at full charge. She had been thrown by an NYPD vehicle that Creel had converted to tungsten and hurled at an overpass, the ricochet sending her sideways through the storefront, and the entire front section of the building collapsed inward in a cascade of glass and structural concrete. The melon survived. Saitama, standing at the center of it, was covered in a fine layer of dust and was holding the melon with both hands to protect it, and was looking at the hole in the wall where Titania had come through with an expression that had moved all the way from mild to slightly inconvenienced, which for Saitama was essentially alarm. Titania pulled herself out of a refrigeration unit, shook the glass off, and looked at the bald man standing in the rubble holding a melon, and made the same error that the wrecking crew had made, which was to interpret his stillness as a lack of threat. She told him to move. She used language that the news feeds later had to bleep, which meant the exchange was captured on audio by 3 separate phones that had been live streaming in the store before the wall came in, and their owners had had the presence of mind to keep rolling even while scrambling backward through the produce wreckage, because human beings with smartphones in 2024 will document the apocalypse on the way out if the angle is good. Saitama looked at her. He looked at the melon. He looked at the hole in the wall. He set the melon down very carefully on a section of shelf that was still intact, which took him a moment to locate, and turned back to face her with the resigned air of a man who had planned a quiet afternoon and was watching it evaporate. What happened next lasted approximately 4 seconds and generated more data for Bruce Banner's ongoing analysis than the entire debrief at the tower had. Titania swung first, a full-power overhead strike that had previously fractured Thor's ribs in their third encounter and had left a 12-inch impression in a reinforced shield containment wall. Saitama sidestepped it without urgency, the movement so casual it barely registered as movement at all, more like a slight lean, the kind of micro-adjustment someone makes to avoid a puddle. The strike hit the floor and went through it, punching a Titania-shaped hole into the basement level. She came back up through the hole with concrete in her hair and genuine fury in her expression, which was the moment she stopped treating this as a nuisance and started treating it as a fight, which was also the moment the fight effectively ended. She threw everything she had, 3 consecutive strikes at speeds that bent the air around her fists, a building support column she tore free and swung like a baseball bat, a leap from the ceiling with full gravitational force behind a double downward blow. Saitama moved through all of it without acceleration, without visible effort, without any of the physical tells that enhanced individuals display when they are actually exerting themselves. The column shattered against his forearm. The ceiling strike hit his shoulder and Titania's wrists flexed backward from the impact. He caught her by the wrist before she could recover, and she went still. He didn't squeeze. He didn't throw her. He just held her wrist in one hand and waited, and the waiting was somehow more frightening than anything that had come before it, because it communicated with complete clarity that he was choosing not to do anything further, which implied a menu of options he was voluntarily declining to exercise. Carl Creel came through the front entrance at that moment, converted to steel, moving at full charge, and Saitama had approximately half a second to process the incoming threat before making his decision. He made it. He released Titania, stepped into Creel's charge, and stopped it with an open hand placed flat against Creel's chest. The force of a steel-bodied, enhanced individual at full sprint hitting an open palm that did not move sent a pressure wave outward through the store that cleared every remaining shelf, blew out the back windows, and was registered on a seismographic sensor 3 blocks away as a micro-tremor. Creel's feet left the ground. He hung there for a moment, suspended against Saitama's palm, his steel form groaning with the strain of something it was not built to withstand. And then Saitama lowered his arm and set him down on the floor in roughly the same way he had set down the wrecking ball 2 days earlier. By the time the Quinjet arrived, Saitama had found a shopping basket that was structurally intact and was moving through the wreckage of the store locating items from an apparent mental list. Steve descended the ramp and stood in the rubble of what had been a functioning grocery store 40 minutes ago, looking at Creel and Titania sitting against the freezer section, neither of them moving voluntarily, and then at Saitama placing a bag of rice carefully into his basket, and said, with the measured calm of a man who had long ago learned to hold his reactions until they were useful, that he was glad Saitama was all right. Saitama said he was fine, but that the melon situation was unfortunate because the one he'd picked was a good one and he'd lost track of it in the rubble. Steve found the melon. It was, improbably, unbroken. He handed it to Saitama. Saitama placed it in the basket with genuine satisfaction. But the city had seen all of it. Every second. 47 live streams. News helicopters that had been repositioning from Midtown. A documentary crew that had been filming an entirely unrelated piece on Broadway small businesses and had captured the entire grocery store sequence in 4K from across the street. And what they had seen, what 90 million views became 230 million views by midnight, was not the Avengers managing a threat. It was a bald man in a tracksuit stopping 2 enhanced individuals who had given the Avengers genuine trouble, with less apparent effort than it takes to parallel park, and then shopping for groceries in the wreckage. The city's relationship with the concept of protection had just shifted in a way that no press release was going to reframe, no official statement was going to contextualize, and no containment protocol Ross had sketched on his legal pad was going to address, because the public didn't care about containment protocols. The public had watched a man catch a wrecking ball on Monday and stop Titania, and the absorbing man on Wednesday, and was now asking a question that nobody in any official capacity had an answer to yet, which was, whose side is he on? That question was about to get much more complicated. The question of whose side Saitama was on reached Thaddeus Ross's desk in the form of a polling report, which was not the form Ross preferred his intelligence to arrive in, but was nonetheless useful because it told him something the satellite feeds and the biometric scans and Bruce Banner's inconclusive instrument readings had not, which was how the civilian population was processing what they had seen. The numbers were unambiguous. 73% of respondents in a 48-hour snap poll described Saitama's interventions as positive. 61% said they felt safer knowing he was in the city. 44%, and this was the number that made Ross set the report down and look at the ceiling for a moment, said they trusted him more than they trusted the Avengers. This was not a threat assessment number. This was a political number, and political numbers had a way of becoming operational constraints faster than any weapon system Ross had ever dealt with. Because you could build a countermeasure for a weapon, but you could not build a countermeasure for public sentiment without the countermeasure itself becoming the story. Ross called Fury. The call lasted 19 minutes and covered ground they had both already mapped privately, but needed to establish as shared understanding before either of them could move. Ross said the individual needed to be formally classified and brought under some framework of accountability, not because he was currently causing harm, but because an unclassified enhanced individual operating publicly in New York with no legal standing, no oversight structure, and no established command relationship was a precedent that made every existing enhanced individual framework look voluntary, which it largely was. But the appearance of voluntariness was doing a great deal of structural work in keeping the whole arrangement stable. Fury said he understood the concern and shared a version of it, but that the approach Ross was describing assumed a leverage point that he was not confident existed, because every conversation with Saitama so far had suggested that the concept of institutional authority simply did not register for him the way it registered for other enhanced individuals. Not because he was defiant, but because he appeared to be operating from a framework in which the question of who had authority over him had never been a relevant question, and he had no existing habit of asking it. Ross said that was exactly the problem. Fury said he knew. What Ross did not tell Fury on that call, because there were things Ross did not discuss on lines that Fury's people had access to, was that he had already initiated a separate track. Project Oversight had been a dormant program for 3 years, a military enhanced response framework that existed on paper as a contingency for scenarios where civilian enhanced individuals operating outside military command created a national security gap that Standard Shield protocol couldn't close. Ross had kept it dormant because the political cost of activating it had always outweighed the strategic benefit when the enhanced individuals in question were the Avengers, who had enough public support and enough congressional allies to make a confrontation expensive. Saitama was different. Saitama had no congressional allies. Saitama had no legal standing. Saitama had been in the country for 72 hours and had already restructurally altered 2 major public incidents in ways that had no oversight, no after-action review, no chain of command. Ross activated Project Oversight on a Thursday morning, which meant that by Friday, a team of 12 military enhanced response specialists was deploying to New York with equipment that had been specifically designed and tested against Class 70 enhanced threats, which had previously been the upper boundary of what they planned for. The Avengers found out about the deployment the way they found out about most things Ross did unilaterally, which was through Natasha, who had a source inside the DoD logistics chain, who was reliable about hardware movements if not always about intentions. She brought it to Tony and Steve simultaneously, which was her way of making sure neither of them had time to stake out a position before they had to discuss it together. Tony's position was that Ross deploying a military-enhanced response team to manage a situation that the Avengers were actively handling was a jurisdictional overreach that he was going to push back on through every legal channel available, which was the position Tony always took when Ross acted unilaterally and was always partially right and never fully effective. Steve's position was more operational. He wanted to know what the team was equipped with, what their rules of engagement were, and whether Saitama knew they were coming. He did not. Nobody had told him. Saitama was, at that moment, in a shield-safe house in Brooklyn that Fury had arranged as a temporary residence, watching television with the focused attention of someone encountering a new medium. He had worked through 3 news channels, 2 competitive cooking programs, and what appeared to be a home improvement show before settling on a nature documentary about ocean life, which he was watching with the first genuine sustained interest he had displayed since arriving. He had made dinner. He had done push-ups, exactly 100, counted aloud in the living room, without any apparent awareness of how this looked to the 2 SHIELD agents stationed outside, who were monitoring via internal camera feed, and had stopped their card game to watch. He had then done sit-ups and squats in the same quantity, changed into clean clothes, and gone to bed at 9:15, which was earlier than any enhanced individual SHIELD had ever monitored had gone to bed, and had slept without interruption until 5:30 the following morning, at which point he had made breakfast and resumed the nature documentary from where he had left off. The military team arrived in New York on Friday afternoon. They did not announce themselves publicly. They staged at a National Guard facility in Queens and spent the first evening in briefings, reviewing all available footage of Saitama's 2 interventions in detail, calibrating their equipment, and establishing rules of engagement that had been written in Washington by people who had watched the same footage and drawn the conclusion that what they were looking at was a manageable enhanced threat of unusual scale. The team commander was a colonel named Whitmore, who had run enhanced response operations in 4 countries and had a reputation for clean execution under pressure. He reviewed the catch footage, the grocery store sequence, the biometric null result, and Bruce Banner's instrument analysis, and then he called Ross directly and said he needed to know if the rules of engagement included kinetic engagement as a first option or only as a last resort, because the footage suggested that anything short of maximum force would not achieve containment. And maximum force against a target of this profile in a civilian urban environment carried collateral consequences that needed to be authorized at the appropriate level. Ross said the rules of engagement were clear in the documentation. Whitmore said he had read the documentation and was asking about the intent behind it. There was a pause. Ross said the intent was accountability. Whitmore said he understood and ended the call, and spent a long time afterward looking at the freeze frame of Saitama's hand, stopping Creel's full-sprint steel-body charge with an open palm and not moving. Steve Rogers found out the rules of engagement through Natasha's source on Saturday morning and went directly to Fury. The conversation was short and did not go the way Steve had hoped, because Fury was operating in the space between 2 institutional forces and had less room to maneuver than his authority implied. He said he would make calls. He made calls. Ross took one of them and did not return the other 2. By Saturday afternoon, the military team was moving from Queens into Brooklyn, into the neighborhood where the SHIELD safe house was, and Steve was in the Quinjet moving to intercept, and Tony was already airborne in the suit, and Thor was somewhere over the Atlantic returning from an Asgard-related situation that had impeccable timing for being the wrong kind, and Natasha was on the ground 2 blocks from the safe house, watching the military vehicles stage through a scope and relaying positions. And nobody had yet told Saitama any of this was happening, because nobody had a clean answer to what telling him would actually accomplish or what he would do with the information. What he was doing was watching the ocean documentary. The segment was about deep-sea creatures that had evolved in complete darkness, developing their own light sources because the environment they lived in offered none. Saitama watched this with the same focused, quiet attention he brought to everything that genuinely interested him. And outside, the vehicles were staging, and down the street Steve's Quinjet was descending, and across the city Ross was in a secure room watching a tactical feed, and somewhere in the deep water of a dozen intelligence agencies, the machinery of institutional response was moving toward a confrontation that every person inside it understood at some level was not going to go the way the documentation said it would. The only person who didn't know it was coming was sitting in a safe house in Brooklyn in clean clothes watching fish glow in the dark, and he was, by every visible measure, completely fine. Colonel Whitmore's team made contact at 6:14 in the evening, which was later than the operational plan had specified, because Steve Rogers had landed the Quinjet in the street in front of the safe house and physically stood in the path of the lead vehicle, which was not something the operational plan had accounted for. The exchange between Steve and Whitmore lasted 8 minutes and was professionally tense in the way that military conversations get when two people with legitimate authority and conflicting mandates are both trying to avoid being the one who escalates first. Steve said the individual inside was not a hostile actor, and that moving military assets into contact without prior engagement by established enhanced response personnel, meaning the Avengers, was a protocol violation that he was formally objecting to on the record. Whitmore said his orders came from a level of authorization that superseded the established enhanced response framework in cases of unclassified enhanced threats, and that he was not asking for permission to proceed. He was informing Captain Rogers of an operation already underway as a professional courtesy. Steve said he understood Whitmore's position and was asking him, as a professional courtesy in return, to hold at current position for 30 minutes while he went inside and talked to Saitama first. Whitmore looked at Steve for a long moment, then at the tactical display on his wrist unit, then back at Steve, and said he would hold for 20 minutes, which was the kind of compromise that both of them understood was not really about the number and was really about the gesture of it. Steve went inside. Saitama was in the kitchen making tea, because the nature documentary had ended and he had decided tea was appropriate for the early evening, a domestic rhythm he had apparently maintained from his own world and saw no reason to interrupt. Steve sat down at the kitchen table and explained the situation in full: the military team outside, Ross's authorization, the rules of engagement that Natasha had obtained, the fact that the institutional response to Saitama's presence had moved faster and harder than Steve had anticipated, and that he was trying to slow it down, but needed Saitama to understand what he was slowing it down from. Saitama listened to all of this while the kettle heated. He asked if the people outside were strong. Steve said they were trained and equipped for enhanced threats and that their equipment was serious. Saitama nodded and poured water into 2 cups and set one in front of Steve, who had not asked for tea but accepted it, and asked if they were stronger than the people from the grocery store. Steve said probably not in terms of raw physical capability, but that they had weapons designed to address that gap. Saitama said him and drank his tea, and appeared to be genuinely processing the information rather than dismissing it, which was a more engaged response than Steve had hoped for, and a less alarmed one than he'd feared. The 20 minutes expired. Whitmore advanced the team. They came in through the front and the back simultaneously, which was standard for enhanced threat containment, split entry to prevent single-point exit, layered fields of fire, equipment hot from the first second of contact. The equipment was serious in the way Ross had promised it was serious. Restraint harnesses designed to output sufficient electromagnetic force to immobilize an individual at Class 80 strength. concussive pulse emitters calibrated to the upper range of what had been tested against enhanced physiology. 2 operators carrying directed energy platforms that had been developed specifically for the Hulk contingency, and never deployed because the Hulk contingency had never reached the threshold that required them. Whitmore came in behind the first wave with the controlled composure of someone who had done this before in harder conditions, and was confident in his preparation. He found Saitama standing in the kitchen next to Steve Rogers, holding a cup of tea, watching the entry team fan out through the safe house with the expression of someone observing a mildly interesting procedural exercise. Whitmore ordered Steve to step aside. Steve said no. Whitmore said that was going to complicate the operation. Steve said he knew. There was a moment, one of those operational pauses where everyone in the room is running a fast calculation about what the next 10 seconds look like, and whether the version they're in is the one they want to be in. And then Saitama set his cup down on the counter and said it was all right, that Steve didn't need to stay, and his tone was not resigned or frightened or compliant in any way that matched the emotional register of someone saying it's all right in a room full of aimed weapons. It was the tone of someone who had accurately assessed the situation and found it manageable and was now removing a variable he was concerned might get hurt. Steve stepped back, not out, just back. Whitmore gave the order. The restraint harnesses deployed, 4 of them simultaneously, electromagnetic field generators that had held a Class 80 individual for 11 minutes in controlled testing. They hit Saitama from 4 directions and the room filled with the hum of their output, and every instrument on every operator's wrist unit spiked into the red, and then the hum changed pitch, rising, straining, and then the harnesses simply stopped working. Not dramatically. Not with an explosion or a visible power surge. They stopped working the way a car engine stops when you've asked it to move something it was never built to move gradually, under increasing load, until the system reaches a point where continuing is no longer physically possible, and it simply quits. The electromagnetic fields collapsed. The harnesses hung loose. Saitama looked down at them and back up at Whitmore with the same mildly inquiring expression he'd worn since the entry team came through the door. Whitmore gave the second order. The concussive pulse emitters fired. The blast was measured afterward at a force output sufficient to render a Class 70 enhanced individual unconscious, and a standard human being seriously dead. It hit Saitama in the chest and he rocked back half a step, the first time any applied force had moved him at all since his arrival, and the half step was so anomalous that every person in the room registered it simultaneously. A collective intake of breath, because a half step implied a threshold, implied a ceiling, implied that somewhere in the parameters of this equipment was something that mattered. Whitmore's hand went to the directed energy platform authorization. His operators moved to positions, and then Saitama looked down at his chest where the blast had hit, looked up at Whitmore, and rocked forward that half step back to where he had been standing, returning to his original position with the deliberate specificity of someone restoring a small order that had been temporarily disrupted, and the expression on his face had not changed in any meaningful way. The directed energy platforms never fired. Not because Whitmore lost his nerve, he hadn't, but because Tony Stark's voice came through every comm unit in the room simultaneously, broadcasting on the military frequency he absolutely was not supposed to have access to. Saying with the particular exhausted certainty of someone who had just finished running a very fast calculation that if those platforms discharged in an enclosed residential building in Brooklyn, the collateral radius would be 4 city blocks, and that he was telling Whitmore this not as a threat but as a physics report, and that he respectfully suggested the colonel consider his next step carefully. There was a pause. Whitmore looked at his operators. He looked at Saitama. He looked at Steve, who was looking at the floor. He gave the stand-down order. The team withdrew in good order, which was a professional achievement under the circumstances. Whitmore was the last one out. At the door he turned back and looked at Saitama one more time, the long assessing look of a man recalibrating, and said, without hostility, that he needed to know what they were actually dealing with. Saitama said he was just a guy who was strong. Whitmore said he understood that. He said it didn't feel like the whole answer. Saitama agreed that it probably wasn't, in the same tone he used for everything, which was the tone of someone for whom the complexity of the situation was acknowledged but not particularly pressing. Whitmore left. The door closed. Steve sat back down at the kitchen table. The tea was cold. Saitama picked his cup up anyway and finished it and then said, in the quiet of the safe house with the tactical vehicles visible through the window beginning to pull away, that he was getting a little tired of people trying things. Not angry, not warning, just stating a fact about his experience with the same mild accuracy he brought to statements about the weather or grocery lists. Steve looked at him and thought about Ross watching the tactical feed in his secure room and recalibrating his own calculations, and about the directed energy platforms that hadn't fired, and about the half-step, that single, significant, unprecedented half-step, and understood that what had just happened was not a resolution. It was a data point, and somewhere in the machinery of institutional response that data point was already being processed into the next attempt, which would be larger and less hesitant and built on everything that had just failed, because that was how the machinery worked, and the machinery did not stop. There is a place beyond the measurable atmosphere where observation happens without participation, where beings of sufficient age and capability watch the surface of worlds the way meteorologists watch weather systems, with professional interest, with accumulated pattern recognition, with the particular detachment of those who have seen enough iterations of a thing to know roughly how it goes and to notice sharply when it doesn't go that way. The watchers do not intervene. This is their foundational principle, older than most civilizations and more consistently maintained than most laws. And it is why Uatu had been standing at the edge of observable space above the Western Hemisphere for 6 days without doing anything except watching, which was all he was permitted to do, and all he intended to do, and which was nonetheless significant because Uatu did not personally attend every anomalous event on every world in his observation sphere. He attended the ones that had the potential to rewrite the pattern of a universe entirely. He had been at Hiroshima. He had been at the moment of Steve Rogers's transformation. He had been present for the first time the Power Stone changed hands on a populated world. He was here now, above Brooklyn, above a safe house where a bald man in a tracksuit had just caused a military containment operation to withdraw without raising his voice. And the fact that Uatu was here, rather than observing remotely, meant something that none of the people on the ground had the framework to know yet. He was not the only one watching. Aboard the Sanctuary, in the deeper dark beyond Saturn's orbit, Thanos had received the initial reports from his intelligence network with the careful attention he brought to all information about power anomalies on inhabited worlds. He did not move immediately. Thanos did not move immediately in the way that water does not move immediately. There was an accumulation happening, a pressure building behind the stillness, and the stillness itself was a form of motion. He had reviewed the footage. He had reviewed Bruce Banner's instrument analysis, which his network had obtained within 48 hours of its compilation. He had reviewed the military containment attempt and its outcome. He sat with all of it for a long time in the way that only beings with genuine patience could sit with things, not suppressing the urgency but genuinely not feeling it, because the calculation he was running was long and the inputs were still arriving. What interested him was not the strength. He had encountered strength before, in many forms, and had a working framework for it. What interested him was the instrument null, the complete absence of any detectable energy signature from a being who had demonstrated physical capability that his own analysts placed conservatively at beyond anything in his existing registry. Something that produced no measurable output while achieving measurable effect was either using a mechanism that his instruments couldn't detect or operating from a source that didn't exist within the energy frameworks he understood. Either answer was interesting. The second answer was more interesting. He told his network to continue monitoring and to escalate immediately if the being's activity pattern changed. Then he returned to his other work, and the returning was itself a statement about how long his timeline was. The Silver Surfer found out differently, which is to say he felt it. Norrin Radd, sailing the currents between star systems on Galactus's behalf, experienced the anomaly as a disturbance in the fundamental resonance of the power cosmic. Not a disruption, exactly, more like a harmonic that didn't belong to any instrument in the orchestra. He altered course toward the source without fully understanding why, which was unusual for him because he typically understood exactly why he did things, and the not understanding was itself information. He crossed the distance in 4 hours. He entered Earth's atmosphere in a long descending arc over the Atlantic and arrived above New York just as the military vehicles were completing their withdrawal from Brooklyn, and he hung there in the upper atmosphere for a while, extending the power cosmic outward in the gentle diagnostic way. He used to read the signature of a world, and found the same thing Bruce Banner had found, the same void where a signature should have been, but felt rather than measured, which was a different kind of knowing, and in some ways a more complete one. He descended slowly. He did not go to the safe house. He went to Avengers Tower instead, because Tony Stark's energy signature was familiar, and because whatever was happening in Brooklyn was clearly already being managed by people closer to it, and because the Silver Surfer understood that arriving at a situation already in motion required tact that his usual entrance style didn't always accommodate. Tony was on the roof when the Surfer landed, which was not a coincidence. Friday had tracked the Surfer's atmospheric entry 12 minutes out, and Tony had come up to receive him rather than scramble a response, which was the posture of someone who had enough context to know that scrambling would be counterproductive, and enough composure to stand on a rooftop in the dark waiting for a Silver Surfer like it was a meeting he'd scheduled. They had a history, not warm exactly but functional, the particular professional respect of two beings who had both at different points stared at scales of power larger than themselves and had not looked away. The Surfer asked about the anomaly. Tony showed him Bruce's data. The Surfer looked at it for a long time, longer than his processing speed required, which meant he was not just reading the data but sitting with what it implied, and then said something that Tony later described to Steve as the most unsettling thing anyone had said to him in a year that had contained a lot of unsettling things. He said that in all his travels across the universe, in every system Galactus had sent him to survey, in every world he had seen die and every world he had seen survive, he had encountered beings of extraordinary power, and he had developed over centuries a reliable intuitive sense for the shape of that power, where it came from, what it was connected to, what it would do at its limit. He said Saitama had no shape, not that his shape was unfamiliar, that he had no shape. That the power cosmic reached toward him and found nothing to grip, nothing to read, nothing to locate within any framework the universe had provided him to understand what he was encountering. He said this the way a navigator says there is no coastline here, not as a metaphor, as a literal report from a functional instrument. Tony said, "Is that bad?" The Surfer said he didn't know, which was the most alarming answer he could have given, because the Silver Surfer knew a great deal, and the boundary of his knowing was drawn very far out. Meanwhile, on the ground, the political consequences of the Brooklyn containment failure were moving faster than anyone in Fury's office had projected. Ross had watched the tactical feed in real time. He had watched the harnesses fail, and the concussive pulse move Saitama half a step, and the directed energy platforms not fire, and he had spent the subsequent 3 hours in a sequence of calls that moved up a chain Ross himself rarely needed to ascend, because Ross was usually the top of the chain for enhanced individual response, and ascending meant going somewhere that had larger tools and longer reach and fewer constraints on their use. He was not explicit about what he was requesting. He used language that was precise and institutional, and that anyone listening would need a specific kind of context to decode. The word he used most was stabilization. The framework he invoked was the one that existed for threats to global security that exceeded the capacity of standard military response. The authorization he received came back in writing within 2 hours, which was faster than it usually came back, which meant the people above him were either more alarmed than he was or had been watching longer, and had already reached conclusions he was only now arriving at. In the safe house, Saitama did 100 push-ups, counted them quietly, and went to bed. In the upper atmosphere, Uadu watched the authorization travel through encrypted channels from a facility in Colorado to a deployment point in the North Atlantic, and his expression, if expression was the right word for what moved across the face of a being who had watched civilizations rise and collapse, was the particular stillness of someone who knows what comes next and has taken a vow not to say so. Across the solar system, Thanos noted the authorization's energy signature in his monitoring network and updated his timeline, moving one variable forward by what he estimated was several weeks. The Silver Surfer descended toward Brooklyn slowly to meet the man whose shape the universe could not read. And in a facility in the North Atlantic, something very large and very deliberate began its preparations, and the preparations were the kind that do not stop once they have started. The Silver Surfer arrived at the safe house at 7 in the morning, which was when Saitama was finishing his run. The run was 10 kilometers, completed in a time that the SHIELD monitoring team's GPS tracker recorded, and then flagged for immediate review because the elapsed time implied a pace that was not physically possible for a human being and was only marginally possible for most enhanced individuals. And yet the tracker data was clean. No anomalies, no GPS drift, no recording errors. Just a straight line of coordinates and timestamps that described someone covering 10 kilometers in a time that should have required legs built differently than the ones Saitama visibly possessed. He came back to the safe house at a walk, breathing normally, not sweating in any quantity that the morning air hadn't already dried, and found the Silver Surfer standing outside the front door on a board that hovered 18 inches above the pavement with the patient stillness of someone who had learned across centuries that waiting was not a cost but simply a condition. Saitama looked at the board with mild interest. He looked at the surfer. He said good morning. The surfer said good morning. They stood there for a moment in the particular quiet of two beings who operate well below their social anxiety thresholds, because neither of them has ever developed much social anxiety. And then Saitama invited him in because there was tea, and it seemed like the appropriate thing to do. They sat at the kitchen table, and the surfer explained who he was, not with pride but with the factual compression of someone giving relevant operational context. Herald of Galactus, Cosmic Surveyor, Centuries of Travel, Power Cosmic. Saitama listened to all of it and asked what the power cosmic was. The surfer considered how to answer this and said it was the fundamental energy of the universe, the base layer beneath all other forces, the thing that all other power was ultimately an expression of. Saitama nodded in the way he nodded at things he found interesting without finding remarkable and asked if it made the surfer strong. The surfer said yes, among other things. Saitama asked how strong. The surfer said he had moved moons and redirected stars and survived conditions that would destroy most beings in the universe. Saitama said him and drank his tea with the expression he wore when he was genuinely considering something, which was nearly identical to the expression he wore when he wasn't considering anything, but was slightly more focused around the eyes. Then Saitama asked the surfer if he wanted to spar. The surfer had not been asked this in a very long time, not because he was unapproachable, but because most beings in the universe who were aware of what he was capable of did not invite physical engagement with him as a casual suggestion over morning tea. He looked at Saitama for a long time with the instrument that the power cosmic provided, and found the same void he had found from orbit: no signature, no shape, nothing to read. And because the surfer was someone who had been shaped by experience rather than ideology, because he had learned to trust data over assumption and had good data that his assumptions could not account for. He said yes. He said they should go somewhere with appropriate space. Saitama agreed and said he knew a spot. The spot was the same impact crater from Monday, which had been cordoned off by the city but was otherwise unoccupied, and which Saitama apparently felt a degree of proprietary comfort toward in the way people feel about places where something significant happened to them. They stood on opposite sides of it in the early morning before the city had fully woken up, the surfer floating 2 feet above the crater's edge, Saitama standing at the bottom with his hands in his pockets, and the 3 SHIELD agents who had followed at a discreet distance exchanged a look that communicated a shared understanding that they were about to observe something they had no protocol for, and that their job in the next few minutes was primarily to not be in the way. The surfer moved first, which was the right tactical decision given that waiting for Saitama to initiate had been demonstrated to be an extremely short experience. He crossed the crater in a fraction of a second at a velocity that bent the air into a visible compression wave, and hit Saitama with a force output that he had calibrated carefully, deliberately pulling back from his actual ceiling to something he estimated at the upper range of what Earth's surface could absorb without structural consequence. The impact was enormous. The crater deepened by 6 feet, the shockwave flattened a chain-link fence 200 meters away, and every car alarm within 3 blocks went off simultaneously. The surfer pulled back to assess. The dust settled. Saitama was standing in the new depression with his hair slightly disturbed and an expression that had moved from baseline to something adjacent to interest, which for Saitama was the equivalent of another person's eyes going wide. He said, "Okay, that was something." He said it the way you say that was something when something has finally happened after a long period of things not happening. And the surfer, who was floating above the crater with the power cosmic crackling quietly along his silver skin and his instruments still returning null, understood in that moment with complete clarity what he was dealing with, which was the first thing that had genuinely unsettled him since the moment Galactus had chosen him. Not fear, unsettlement. The specific cognitive experience of encountering a thing that does not fit and being sophisticated enough to know that the thing not fitting is the information, not an error. Saitama hit him back. He did not use full force. He was visibly, deliberately restrained in the way that the surfer had been visibly, deliberately restrained, and what he used as a measured response was nonetheless something the surfer felt in every register the power cosmic provided. Felt it the way a planet feels an impact, as a fundamental addressed fact rather than a surface event. He was moved backward across the crater, across the street, through 40 feet of air, and stopped himself against a building facade that cracked in a spiderweb pattern from the force of him breaking against it. He hung there for a moment, silver hands pressed against brick, processing. Then he came back to the crater at a slower speed and looked at Saitama from 20 feet away and said, very quietly, that he understood now why his instruments returned nothing. He said that Saitama's power did not exist within the framework the universe used to measure power, not because it was hidden or shielded, but because it was prior to the framework. Older than the system the power cosmic was built to read, the way a color outside the visible spectrum is not absent from the world, but simply outside the range of the instrument examining it. Saitama said he didn't really understand any of that. He said he just trained hard. The surfer said he believed him, and meant it in a way that was more philosophically significant than it sounded, because to the surfer believing him meant accepting that the training explanation, ordinary, physical, repetitive human training with no energy input, no cosmic event, no external transformation, had somehow produced something outside the universe's existing vocabulary for power, which was either the most extraordinary thing he had ever encountered or a confirmation of a theory he had held for a long time about the nature of limits, and what happened to beings who encountered them honestly and kept going regardless. He said Saitama should know that his presence here had been noticed beyond Earth. He said the word Galactus carefully, because it was a word that had specific effects on the humans he had encountered, and he wanted to observe how it landed. Saitama said he didn't know who that was. The surfer said he was an entity that consumed worlds. Saitama said that sounded bad. The surfer said it was, generally. Saitama asked if he was coming here. The surfer said not immediately, but that Saitama's arrival had introduced a variable that changed the calculation of several beings whose calculations mattered. Saitama said okay and looked at the crater and then back at the surfer and asked if he wanted to go again, with a little more effort this time. The surfer said yes. The second exchange lasted 47 seconds and redistributed enough kinetic force to register on seismographs in 3 states. The shield monitoring team retreated to a distance they assessed as safer, and which was not actually safer, but was the distance at which the alternative felt more professional than cowering. Tony Stark, watching via satellite feed from the tower, sat completely still through all 47 seconds with his hands flat on the desk, and his face doing something that Happy Hogan, standing behind him, would later describe as the look Tony got when the universe was explaining something to him that he hadn't asked to learn. When it was over, both figures were still standing. The crater was significantly larger. 7 parked cars within the blast radius had been relocated by shockwave to positions their owners would spend the next week arguing with insurance companies about. And somewhere above the earth, Uatu had adjusted his position, moving infinitesimally closer in the way that beings who have taken vows of non-interference allow themselves to acknowledge that something has happened worth witnessing more carefully. The surfer left at 9 in the morning. He did not go to report to Galactus immediately, which was not unusual but was noted by the network that Thanos maintained, and the nodding was filed and the timeline was updated again. He went instead to the edge of the solar system and stopped there, and looked back at the blue marble of Earth with the power cosmic extending outward from him in all directions like a man checking his own pulse. And the reading he got was the same null it had always been. And he stayed there for a long time thinking about what lay outside the range of the instrument. Below, in a deepened crater in Midtown Manhattan, Saitama was brushing dust off his tracksuit and thinking about breakfast. And the contrast between those two activities and their cosmic implications was the kind of thing that the universe, if it had a sense of humor, would have found very funny. The world above was watching. The world below was about to run out of options it had already tried. And in the space between those two conditions, something was going to have to give. Not today, not this morning, not while the surfer was at the edge of the solar system thinking and Saitama was thinking about eggs, but soon, and in a way that none of the watchers or the planners or the beings running long calculations had fully accounted for yet, because the variable they were all working around had not yet decided to become a variable. He was still just a man eating breakfast in a city that didn't know what to do with him. That was about to stop being true. There was no prior signal that the monitoring networks caught in time to be useful. The early warning systems that SWORD had maintained in the outer solar system since the Kree incursion, passive sensors, quantum-entangled tripwires, the Silver Surfer's own dormant beacon network that Stark had quietly tapped into 18 months ago, produced a single coherent alarm that lasted approximately 4 seconds before the scale of what was arriving overwhelmed the instruments measuring it, and they defaulted to maximum reading on every gauge simultaneously. Which was their way of saying the thing coming was beyond the range they had been designed to detect, and the alarm itself was the last useful thing they would do. After that, there was just the shadow, not a metaphorical shadow. A literal one, cast across the night side of Earth as something of sufficient size moved between the planet and the sun, and reduced direct solar output to a measurable percentage of normal for 11 minutes before the shape of it became clear enough on telescopic feeds to be identified as a structure. A craft. A thing built rather than grown. And even knowing it was built did not make it less catastrophic to look at, because the scale of it rewired the brain's sense of context in real time. People who saw it through telescopes called emergency services. People who saw it on news feeds called family members. People who saw it with their naked eyes from anywhere with clear sky said nothing, because some things silence language before language can form. The Avengers were already in the air. SWORD had pushed the 4-second alarm to every enhanced individual they had contact protocols with before the instruments failed, which meant Thor was descending from the upper atmosphere in a column of lightning that would have been impressive under any other circumstances. And Tony was in the Mark L with all available power rooted to external sensors. And Carol Danvers, Captain Marvel, had arrived from deep space in the preceding 20 minutes because she had seen Galactus coming from further out and had pushed her speed to its absolute ceiling to get here first, arriving with the particular controlled urgency of someone bringing the worst news they know and choosing not to waste time on the delivery. She told Fury in 3 sentences. Fury told Steve. Steve told the team. The team was already in motion. Saitama found out from the television. The emergency broadcast had interrupted everything across every channel simultaneously, the way emergency broadcasts do, and Saitama had been watching a competitive cooking program. The contestants had just been presented with a mystery ingredient challenge involving unusual root vegetables, which he had found genuinely engaging. And then the screen cut to the standard alert pattern, and then to a live satellite feed of the shadow moving across the Pacific, and then to a news anchor who was maintaining professional composure in the way that news anchors maintain professional composure when they are reading copy that their brains are refusing to fully process. Saitama looked at the shadow on the screen. He looked at it for a long time. Then he put on his cape, because he had started wearing it again sometime in the 2nd week, partly out of habit and partly because it had become a recognizable visual identifier that seemed to help people place him in context, and he went outside. The sky above Brooklyn was doing something that skis above Brooklyn are not supposed to do, which is be partially dark at midday. The shadow's edge was visible to the northeast, a clean Terminator line moving slowly across the city as Galactus's worldship repositioned above the eastern seaboard. And the quality of the light remaining was wrong in the specific way that light is wrong when the thing filtering it is not atmospheric. People in the street had stopped moving. Cars had stopped. The particular paralysis that descends on human beings when something exists at a scale that the human nervous system was not built to process. Not fear exactly, because fear requires a threat you can conceptualize, and this was beyond conceptualization, had settled over the neighborhood like a second shadow. Saitama looked at the sky with his hands in his pockets, and then looked at the people around him who had stopped moving and then back at the sky, and his expression moved through its usual range of minimal variation, and arrived at something that was the closest thing to serious he had displayed since his arrival. Not alarmed. Serious. The distinction mattered because alarm implied uncertainty and serious implied that he had assessed the situation and formed a position. He looked up and jumped. He did not accelerate through a run-up. He did not crouch into a launch posture. He stood on a sidewalk in Brooklyn and jumped, and the jump took him out of the visible atmosphere in 11 seconds, which meant that the shockwave from his departure hit the street below hard enough to crack the pavement in a 20-foot radius and blow out the windows of the 4 nearest buildings, and knock every person within 50 feet off their feet, gently but completely, and then he was gone. A white and yellow streak ascending through cloud cover, and then through the stratosphere, and then through the exosphere, and then into the dark. And the monitoring systems that SWORD still had operational tracked his ascent for 6 seconds before his velocity exceeded their refresh rate, and the track became a projection rather than an observation. Thor saw him go. He was descending from the upper atmosphere when the streak went past him going the other direction at a speed that his Asgardian senses registered as faster than anything he had encountered outside of direct divine intervention, and he turned to watch it go with the expression of someone revising a significant assumption in real time. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. Carol Danvers was 3,000 miles out, moving toward Galactus at her maximum sustainable speed, with her energy output at the ceiling of what she could maintain without burning through her reserves before contact, when something passed her going the other direction so fast that the pressure wave hit her sideways and she had to compensate for the tumble. And by the time she had stabilized and looked back, there was nothing there. She identified it on trajectory as originating from Earth below. She did not recognize the object. She ran a quick scan on the trajectory intercept point and then pushed harder. Galactus was aware of Saitama before Saitama arrived. This was not remarkable. Galactus was aware of everything in a solar system he had marked as a feeding location, with the comprehensive environmental sensing of a being whose existence was geological in timescale. What was remarkable was the nature of the awareness, which was different from his awareness of other beings, in a way that his ancient and comprehensive mind spent several seconds examining before he reached the structure's outer surface. He did not feel a power signature. He felt an absence where a power signature should be, and the absence had a shape. Or rather, the absence of a shape was itself the shape, which was a paradox that his cosmological processing had not encountered before, and which his mind, for the first time in what might be measured in millennia, did not immediately resolve. He looked at the approaching point of trajectory with something that the universe might have called attention if it had been watching, which it was, and waited. Saitama hit the outer surface of the worldship at a velocity that should not have been survivable for anything biological, and produced a crater in the structure's hull. A hull made of materials that Galactus had engineered across multiple universal cycles, and that had survived the death of stars and the pressure of collapsing galaxies, produced a crater 40 meters wide and 60 meters deep, because Saitama's arrival at scale was always a crater. And the impact shockwave propagated through the hull in every direction as a structural event, that the worldship's internal systems registered as damage for the first time in longer than most civilizations had existed. Galactus looked at the crater. He looked at the being standing at its center, dusty, in a yellow cape, looking up at the being above him with an expression that was as close to engaged as Saitama's face got. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds and contained, in the estimation of Yuadu watching from nearby space, more information than most conversations he had observed across the history of the universe. Then Saitama said, with complete sincerity, that he was bigger than he expected. And Galactus, who had not been spoken to in that tone since before the current universe's formation, looked down at this small, bald figure standing in a crater in his hull and felt, for the first time in an existence so long it had ceased to have a personal sense of duration, something that was not quite curiosity and not quite recognition, and not quite either of the things he had frameworks for, but was undeniably something. And the something was the beginning of a shift in the calculations of every being who had been running them, because the encounter they had all been modeling in abstract had just become specific, and specific was a different country entirely, and none of the maps they had drawn were going to be accurate there. Galactus did not immediately attack. This was the first thing that surprised everyone monitoring the encounter from below and from orbit and from the further dark, because Galactus arriving at a world he intended to consume had a well-documented behavioral pattern, and that pattern did not include pausing to examine a single figure standing in a hull crater. He paused. He looked. His eyes, if eyes was the right word for the perception organs of a being whose consciousness operated at the scale of geological time, moved across Saitama with the focused quality of a being who was genuinely trying to read something and encountering, for the first time, a text in a language he did not have. The power cosmic extended from him in a diagnostic pulse that moved outward through the hull and across the surface of his worldship and reached Saitama, and found the same null that the surfer had found, and that Bruce's instruments had found. And Galactus held that null in his perception for a long moment, the way you hold an unexpected silence in a conversation, listening for what it means. Then he spoke. His voice at normal register was a physical event. It propagated through the hull as vibration, and through space as something beyond sound. A resonance that Carol Danvers felt in her bones from 2,000 miles out, and that Thor, descending through the atmosphere below, experienced as a pressure change that made his ears ring despite Asgardian physiology. What he said was not a greeting and not a threat. He asked Saitama what he was. The question was cosmic in scope, but grammatically simple, and it traveled through the structure of the worldship to the small, bald figure in the crater, with the directness of something said across a table, rather than across a scale differential of incalculable magnitude. Because Galactus was old enough to have stopped performing scale, and simply spoke at whatever register the moment required. Saitama said he was a hero. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without inflation, with the slight undercurrent of tiredness that came from having said it before to people who found the answer inadequate. He said he did it as a hobby. Galactus was silent for 2 seconds, which was Galactus processing something, and the processing of something by Galactus required more computational substrate than existed in most star systems. Then Galactus said that a hero who exists as hobby was a contradiction he would like to examine further. Saitama said he didn't mind, but that the examining would need to happen somewhere other than here, because the reason he'd come up was that the thing with the shadow over the city was a problem, and he'd like it to stop. He said it the way you ask a neighbor to turn down music, not confrontationally, as a reasonable request between parties who had not yet established whether they had a conflict. Galactus said that he intended to consume this world. He said it as a statement of agenda rather than a declaration of war, the way a schedule is communicated rather than a threat is delivered, because to Galactus consuming a world was a metabolic function, and metabolic functions were not threats, they were simply facts of existence. Saitama said that was going to be a problem. Galactus said that Saitama was not in a position to make it one. It was the most significant miscalculation Galactus had made in a span of time that preceded the current universe's formation, and he made it with the full weight of his cosmological awareness behind it, which meant the error was comprehensive. The first exchange was initiated by Galactus, because Galactus did not negotiate past the opening position, and he had stated his position and had Saitama's position, and had run his assessment, and the assessment said proceed. What proceeded was the power cosmic applied as a focused beam of fundamental universal energy. Not a weapon exactly, because Galactus did not carry weapons in the way smaller beings did. What he directed at Saitama was the same energy that had unmade planets and restructured star systems, applied with the specificity of a being who understood exactly what he was aiming at, and had calibrated for the target's apparent physical capacity, which was the precise information he did not have, and the precision of the calibration was therefore the measure of the mistake. The beam hit Saitama and the worldship's hull exploded outward in a 200-meter radius from the point of impact, as the energy dispersed through every vector it could find that wasn't Saitama, because Saitama was not dispersing it. Saitama was standing in it the way a stone stands in a river. And the light was enormous and the heat was star-adjacent, and when it stopped the hull was devastated in a ring around a perfectly intact yellow-caped figure who was looking down at himself, and then up at Galactus, with an expression that had completed its journey from serious to something else entirely. Not anger, something older than anger and quieter, the expression of someone for whom a thing has finally happened that answers a question they had stopped expecting to have answered. There was something almost like relief in it, and something that in a different context might have been called happiness, except that the context was the hull of a worldship above Earth with a cosmic entity looking down at him. So relief and happiness felt like the wrong words, but they were the closest the vocabulary had. What it actually was recognition. Saitama had found something that required his full attention, and his full attention was the rarest thing in the universe. He pulled his fist back. The wind-up was slow. Glacially, deliberately slow, the way a person moves when they are being careful about something they know will have consequences. His arm drew back until his fist was behind his shoulder, and he paused there for 1 full second. 1 second in which Carol Danvers arrived at the hull's outer perimeter and saw him, and stopped herself from approaching because something in the quality of the moment communicated that approaching was the wrong move. And then he punched. The punch did not hit Galactus directly. Saitama's fist stopped 4 feet short of contact, at the apex of the swing, and what traveled the remaining distance and beyond was air. Displaced air. The pressure of a punch so fast that the atmosphere it moved through compressed, and then released in a wave that expanded outward from the fist at a velocity that made the concept of shockwave an understatement. The way calling the Pacific Ocean a puddle is an understatement. It hit Galactus as a wall of pure force generated not by impact, but by displacement. And it hit him the way nothing had hit him since the death of the previous universe. Hit him not on the surface but through him, through the power cosmic, and through the thing beneath the power cosmic, and through whatever existed beneath that. A force that did not interact with energy, but with existence more fundamentally than energy accounted for. Galactus moved. Not by choice. That was the part that Uatu watched from outside the system, with something he had not felt in longer than he could accurately measure. Because Galactus moving by force rather than by will was the kind of event the universe had a handful of in its entire recorded history, and Uatu had witnessed most of them, and none of them had looked like this. Because this was a being of biological origin who had trained for 3 years in a standard atmosphere, hitting something with a knot punch and moving Galactus. And the movement was significant, not across the solar system, not dramatic in the scale of what cosmic battles sometimes produced, but Galactus moved backward through space, a controlled displacement of a being who weighed as much as a small moon on a good day. And he stopped himself and turned and faced the direction he had come from and looked at the hull of his own worldship, and at the figure floating at the crater's edge, Cape moving in the solar wind, and Galactus was quiet. The quiet had texture. It was not the quiet of defeat. Galactus had not been defeated, had not been hurt in any way he would describe as hurt, but he had been moved and moved without his consent, and that distinction carried implications his cosmological processing was currently working through at the full depth of his capacity, which was a depth that had no earthly analog. He looked at Saitama. He processed the null signature. He processed the force event. He ran the calculation that the Silver Surfer had run, and that Bruce Banner had run and arrived at the same terminus. There was no framework in which this result made sense. And then he did something that beings of his age and capability rarely do. He revised his prior model entirely rather than trying to fit the new data into the old one. He set down the assumption that he understood what he was dealing with and looked at what was actually in front of him with the fresh epistemological stance of someone beginning a new inquiry, which in practice looked like Galactus floating in space, looking at a bald man in a yellow cape, and saying nothing for a period of time that Carol Danvers later estimated at 45 seconds, and that felt, to the people monitoring from Earth, like a duration that did not belong in the same universe as the concept of seconds. Then Galactus said that he would not consume this world today. He did not say he would not come back. He did not negotiate terms. He simply stated that today was no longer the day, and the specificity of today implied a conversation that was not finished, a calculation that had been suspended pending new inputs, a return that existed as a future variable in a timeline that a being of Galactus's nature maintained with the patience of geological process. He began to withdraw. The worldship moved. The shadow over the eastern seaboard receded, and the sunlight came back by degrees, and the people in the streets of Brooklyn who had been frozen by something they could not name slowly unfroze and started moving again, not because they understood what had changed, but because something in the quality of the air had shifted in the way it shifts after a storm that didn't quite arrive. Below, in Fury's situation room, no one said anything for a long time. Carol Danvers descended through the atmosphere and landed on the tower roof, and accepted a cup of coffee from a SHIELD agent who offered it with the mechanical courtesy of someone going through motions, because the motions were all they had. Thor had landed on the roof beside her, and was looking at the sky with the expression he wore when Asgard's understanding of the universe had just been updated by events. Tony was running the impact force analysis for the second time, because the first time had produced numbers he had set aside as instrument error, and the second time was producing the same numbers, which meant they were not instrument error, and he was going to have to decide what to do with them. And on the hull of a retreating worldship, Saitama floated in the lee of the crater he had made with his arrival, and looked at the shrinking planet below him, and thought about the punch he had thrown, and about the feeling that had come with it. The specific quality of releasing something at full effort and feeling it be received rather than passing through nothing. And it was not quite satisfaction, because satisfaction implied a resolution, and this was not resolved. Galactus was coming back, and the world still had a problem, and he still did not know how to get home, and there was still a military team in Queens with directed energy platforms that hadn't been stood down. But it was something adjacent to satisfaction, something in the neighborhood of that feeling. He had swung for something, and it had been there. He had hit something real. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The world did not celebrate the way it should have. That was the first sign that something had changed in the underlying structure of how the public was processing events, because by any objective measure what had happened in the previous 72 hours was a civilization-level rescue. Galactus had come. Galactus had been turned away. The planet was intact, and the response to that should have been the particular collective exhale of 7 billion people who had just avoided something unsurvivable. There was some of that. There were crowds in major cities. There was a news cycle that spent 48 hours rotating through the same satellite footage, and the same panel discussions, and the same expert commentary from astrophysicists who had watched the worldship shadow, and were now being asked to explain what a punch that moved Galactus meant in physical terms, and were giving answers that were technically accurate and humanly useless, because no framework of technical accuracy was adequate to the experience of it. But underneath the celebration, running through it like a fault line through stable ground, was something else. A question that nobody was asking directly, but that was shaping every conversation that mattered, and the question was, what are we going to do about the fact that the thing that saved us is not ours? Fury understood this before anyone put it into language. He had spent 30 years building systems whose fundamental premise was that enhanced capability, when it existed on Earth, needed to exist within a framework, imperfect, contested, frequently compromised, but a framework, because the alternative was a world where individual power operated without accountability, and that world had a historical record that was not encouraging. The Avengers were a framework. An imperfect one, frequently contested, sometimes broken and rebuilt, but structurally a framework. Saitama was not in any framework. Saitama had arrived from somewhere else and had spent 2 weeks declining to be classified, declining to be contained, declining to be measured, not from defiance but from a combination of genuine disinterest in the question of classification and a physical reality that made containment a theoretical rather than operational concept. He had saved the world from Galactus without being asked, without coordination, without informing the Avengers or Sword or any monitoring authority, and the saving itself was the problem in the way that only truly significant things can be problems. Not because it was bad, but because it established something. It established that the most significant defensive event in recent human history had been performed by an individual with no institutional relationship to any human authority, no legal standing, no chain of command, and no particular investment in the question of accountability. Ross's response to this was to escalate in the only direction he had left, which was upward. His previous attempts, the legal pad protocol, the military containment team, the directed energy platforms, had exhausted the military enhanced response toolkit at its upper practical limit. What remained above that limit was the category of assets that were not discussed in standard briefings, that existed in compartments requiring special access, that represented the choices governments make when they have decided the situation is different in kind from what their normal frameworks address. Ross went to those compartments. He found one asset that had been developed specifically for cosmic-level enhanced threats and had never been deployed because the scenario it was designed for had never previously materialized. The asset was not a weapon in the conventional sense. It was a mechanism, a device built on PIM particle research and modified with elements from the Tesseract's energy signature that Bruce Banner had cataloged years earlier, that was theoretically capable of generating a localized space-time displacement field, which was a technical way of saying it could, in principle, move a targeted individual to a location that was not Earth, not harm them, not contain them, relocate them, send them somewhere else. Make them someone else's problem, which Ross understood was not a moral position, but was a position nonetheless, and positions were what you had when solutions weren't available. He briefed 2 senators and a deputy national security advisor on a Thursday morning, 12 days after Saitama's arrival. He used careful language, and he used it carefully. The response was conditional authorization, not approval, not a green light, but a conditional architecture that said if certain thresholds were met. Specifically, if SHIELD confirmed that the individual represented an ongoing national security concern that could not be managed through existing frameworks, the mechanism could be deployed. Ross walked out of that briefing with what he needed and spent the rest of the day not thinking about the half-step, because thinking about the half-step led to a place he couldn't operate from, and he needed to be operational. What he did not know, because the compartment he had gone into was truly compartmentalized in a way that Fury's network had not fully penetrated, was that Fury found out anyway. Not through Natasha's 2D source, who had no visibility into that tier. Through Tony Stark, who had been running a passive scan on every quantum-level energy signature within monitoring range, since Bruce's null result had told him their standard instruments were inadequate, and who had detected the PIM Tesseract hybrid field activation in a facility outside Baltimore during its first calibration test. Tony had identified what it was within 6 hours, had sat with the identification for 4 hours while he thought about what to do with it, and had then called Fury rather than going directly to Saitama, which was the decision that defined the next 72 hours. He called Fury because Tony had learned, at significant personal cost, that unilateral action on information with this level of institutional weight behind it had a way of producing outcomes that were worse than the problem they addressed. He called Fury and told him what he'd found and what it was designed to do and waited. Fury called Ross. The call was short, and its substance was that Fury was aware of the mechanism and its intended application, and that he was formally objecting on the grounds that the deployment of a forced space-time displacement device against an individual who had committed no offense, who had, in fact, prevented a planetary consumption event within the preceding 72 hours, was not a national security measure. It was something else, and the something else had a name that nobody on the call used, but that everyone on the call understood. Ross said that national security judgments were his to make within his authorization, and that Fury's objection was noted. He said noted with the particular flatness of a man who has logged something into a record he does not intend to consult. Fury said he understood. He ended the call and looked at the ceiling and then called Steve. Steve went to Saitama that evening. He had been working toward a version of this conversation since the first days after the world-ship shadow cleared, approaching it from different angles in his mind, testing formulations, because this was the kind of conversation where how you said it was inseparable from what you said and both mattered. He sat at the kitchen table in the Brooklyn safe house and told Saitama about the mechanism. He told him what it was designed to do. He told him about Ross's authorization and his own objection and Fury's call and the conditional nature of the deployment threshold. He told him all of it without shaping it toward a conclusion, because he had decided that shaping it was the wrong thing to do. Saitama listened through all of it, which took 8 minutes, and then was quiet for a moment. He said, "They want to send me somewhere else." Steve said that was the mechanism's designed function, yes. Saitama said, "Because of the thing with the planet." Steve said it was more complicated than that. It was about accountability and frameworks and precedent and institutional response to unclassified power, and he could explain all of those dimensions if that was useful. Saitama said that was okay, that he understood it roughly. He said it the way he said most things, without bitterness or alarm, but there was something underneath the plainness of it that Steve had not heard before, something that required sitting with for a moment before it resolved into recognizable feeling. It was tiredness. Not physical tiredness. Saitama was incapable of physical tiredness in any conventional sense. It was the other kind. The kind that accumulates when the world keeps responding to you with mechanisms and protocols and containment architectures, when all you were doing was being what you are, and trying to find something real to put your full effort against. And the world keeps flinching rather than meeting you. And the flinching after a while stops feeling like caution and starts feeling like a verdict. He said, "I stopped something from eating this planet." Steve said, "I know." He said, "And now they want to send me somewhere." Steve said, "I'm not going to let that happen if I can prevent it." And then he said something he had been working toward for 12 days without knowing it, which was that he didn't know what Saitama was or where he came from or how to measure what he could do, but that what he had seen in 2 weeks was a person who showed up, who stopped things, who did not ask for credit or coordinates or authorization, who bought groceries and watched television and did his push-ups and went to bed at 9:15, and then jumped into space when the shadow appeared because somebody needed to. He said that was a pattern he recognized. He said he was going to fight for Saitama to stay, not as a weapon and not as an asset, and not as a classified, enhanced individual under institutional oversight, but as a person who had done what people who can do things ought to do, which is show up. Saitama looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Okay." Not grateful. Saitama was not a person who performed gratitude, but the okay had weight to it, the weight of something received and placed somewhere real rather than set aside. He asked if there was anything on television. Steve looked at the remote and said there was a nature documentary about mountain ecosystems if he wanted. Saitama said that sounded fine. They watched it together, and outside the city moved around the safe house with the particular energy of a city that has survived something enormous and is not yet sure what to do with the survival. And in a facility outside Baltimore, a mechanism sat in calibrated readiness, waiting for a threshold that Ross had defined, and that Fury was going to spend the next 24 hours trying to redefine. And somewhere above the solar system, a worldship was moving at the pace of geological time toward a calculation it had not yet completed, and the things that had not happened yet were gathering in the way that they do, quietly, at the edges of the things that had. The next day was going to change everything in a way that everything being changed the previous 12 days had only been preparation for, not because the mechanism deployed, not because Ross won the institutional argument, but because a decision was being made in a place none of them were monitoring, by a being none of them had fully accounted for, and the decision, when it arrived, was going to ask a question that the world did not have a ready answer to. And the question was going to be addressed not to the governments or the Avengers or the institutional frameworks that had spent 2 weeks trying to fit an anomaly into existing categories. It was going to be addressed to Saitama directly, by name, across a medium that made every communications channel humanity had built look like 2 cans on a string. And what Saitama said in response was going to determine what the world looked like from that moment forward. And no protocol and no mechanism and no legal pad of containment strategies was going to be in the room when it happened. It was going to be just him, as it had always been just him, as it had been just him since the moment he landed in a crater on a Tuesday morning and set down a wrecking ball and asked where the good shawarma was. The message came through every screen on Earth simultaneously at 6:47 in the morning on a Friday, which was the kind of timing that suggested either the being sending it had a thorough understanding of human media cycles, or simply did not have the concept of time zones, and had picked a moment that felt right by other criteria entirely. Every television, every phone, every monitor, every display panel in every city on every continent received the same signal, which bypassed every transmission protocol and every broadcasting infrastructure, as though those things did not exist, because to the being sending it, they did not exist in any meaningful operational sense. The signal resolved into an image, and the image was Galactus, not his worldship, not a representation, but the being himself rendered at a scale that the screens could contain only, because he had chosen to present himself at a scale the screens could contain, which was itself a form of consideration that nobody who had studied his historical behavior had any framework for. He was looking directly into the camera that he was also the camera for, in the way that beings of sufficient cosmic awareness can observe and be observed simultaneously, and he spoke. He said he had completed his calculation. He said that the world called Earth contained a variable he had not encountered in the current universal cycle, and that the variable's presence changed the strategic value of the world's consumption in a way that his prior model had not accounted for. He said that a world containing something outside the universe's existing framework for power was a world that served a different function than sustenance in the cosmological architecture he was part of, and that function was observation, because things that existed outside the framework were rare enough that their existence constituted information about the nature of the framework itself, and information of that quality was worth more than the energy his consumption would provide. He said, therefore, that he was reclassifying Earth from a consumption target to an observation point. He said this would hold for as long as the variable remained present and active on the planet's surface. He said the protection was conditional, not granted. It was structural, derived from the variable's presence, and would dissolve if the variable was removed. He said the variable's name, which he had obtained from his network, was Saitama. He said it once clearly, and then the screens went dark and returned to whatever they had been showing before, and the competitive cooking program resumed mid-challenge, and the news broadcasts resumed mid-sentence, and the phones went back to notifications, and the world was in a different condition than it had been 90 seconds earlier in a way that would take months to fully articulate, but that everyone who had been awake and looking at a screen could feel immediately and completely. In Fury's Situation Room, the silence lasted a long time. Natasha was the first to speak, and what she said was, he just made Saitama the planet's protection condition. Not asset, not defender, not enhanced individual under institutional oversight. Condition. The word hung in the air, and everyone in the room sat with what it meant, which was that the security architecture of the entire planet had just been restructured around the presence of one person who had arrived 2 weeks ago and bought groceries in a wrecked store and gone to bed at 9:15. Maria Hill said, "What happens to Ross's mechanism?" Fury said, "It becomes a device that ends planetary protection if deployed, which makes it a weapon of mass extinction by proxy," and he said it with the flatness of someone describing a physics problem rather than a political situation, because it had passed the point where political framing was adequate. Ross's mechanism had not been designed for this scenario. No mechanism had been designed for this scenario. The scenario was new. Ross found out from the same television broadcast as everyone else, which was the part that he would never fully recover from professionally, and which was appropriate in the specific way that things are appropriate when the universe decides to make a point. He watched the broadcast in his office with 2 aides who did not say anything, and who he did not ask to say anything. And afterward he sat for a very long time with the yellow legal pad in front of him, and then he put it in a drawer and did not take it out again. The mechanism remained in its facility outside Baltimore in calibrated readiness, and would remain there indefinitely, because the authorization threshold was now also a planetary extinction threshold, and no politician in any democracy was going to sign off on that no matter how the language was constructed. Not because they had developed a conscience about it, because the optics were unsurvivable. Galactus had made Ross's entire containment architecture not just ineffective but politically impossible, and had done it without addressing Ross directly, without negotiating, without even appearing to know Ross existed, which was the most complete form of irrelevance that could be visited upon a man who had built his identity around being the person who made the hard calls. Tony Stark spent the morning running models, not weapon models or containment models, framework models. He had begun, somewhere around day 8 of Saitama's presence, and accelerating sharply after the world-ship encounter, to think about the question of what it meant to have something in the world that could not be fitted into existing frameworks, and whether the answer was to build a better framework, or to accept that some things existed outside of frameworks, and to find a way to relate to that existence that was functional rather than institutional. The models he was running were not engineering models. They were closer to diplomatic models, which Tony building diplomatic models was itself a kind of paradigm shift that Pepper would have noted if she had been watching. And she was, and she did note it. And she did not say anything because the moment didn't call for it, and she had developed good timing over years of living with someone who processed transformation loudly. He was trying to model what an honest relationship between the Avengers and Saitama looked like, not employment, not oversight, not classification, but the thing you arrived at when you accepted that the person you were dealing with was genuinely more capable than any institutional response you had, and that the right response to that was not control but alignment. He had not finished the model. He called it something working title in his files that he changed 3 times. The third version he kept. Steve went to the safe house at 9 in the morning. Saitama had seen the broadcast. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and the expression he wore when he was thinking, which was the same as his other expressions but slightly more focused around the eyes, and he had clearly been sitting there since the broadcast ended because the tea was cold, and he had not moved to refresh it. Steve sat down across from him and did not say anything immediately, because the moment did not immediately require language, and Steve had learned that pushing language into moments that didn't require it was a way of making them smaller than they were. They sat together for a while in the particular quiet of 2 people who have been through enough in a short time to have established a kind of understanding that doesn't need constant maintenance. Then Saitama said, "So I'm the reason the planet doesn't get eaten." Steve said, "That's what it sounds like." Saitama said, "And if they send me somewhere else it gets eaten." Steve said, "That's the implication." Saitama said him and looked at his cold tea, and then out the window at the Brooklyn street, where normal life was operating with the specific determination of people who have decided that if everything might end it might as well end while they're getting coffee and arguing with cabs, which is the survival mechanism of cities and also their greatest strength. He said, "I'm not going anywhere then." He said it not as a declaration and not as a position statement. He said it the way he said most decisive things, which was plainly as a description of what was true, delivered without performance because performance required caring what the audience thought, and Saitama's relationship with audience opinion was professionally distant. He said it and picked up his cold tea and drank it anyway, because it was still tea. The world did not return to normal. That was the irreversible part, not the mechanism in Baltimore, not Galactus's reclassification, not the Avengers' revised relationship with the question of accountability, not Ross's legal pad in the drawer. All of those were real changes, and none of them were the irreversible thing. The irreversible thing was simpler and had happened earlier, on the day of the impact crater and the wrecking ball, and it was just that people had seen something and could not unsee it. They had seen a scale of capability that reframed every prior reference point, and they had seen it expressed by someone who bought groceries in the wreckage and watched nature documentaries and went to bed at 9:15. And the combination of those two things, the capability and the person, had done something to the public understanding of what protection meant and who could provide it, and what the relationship between those things and institutional authority actually was. The question of whose side is he on, which had first been asked after the grocery store incident, had resolved not into an answer but into a better question, which was, what does it mean to have a side if the thing protecting you is not interested in the concept of sides? Thor had thoughts about this. He expressed them to Steve over the following week in a series of conversations that were partly Asgardian philosophy and partly genuine grappling with something that challenged his existing frame. He said that in Asgard there was a concept. He said the word in Old Norse and then translated it as roughly the weight of presence, the idea that some beings altered the conditions of existence around them simply by existing in a place, not through action, but through the fact of their being there. He said Saitama was the most complete expression of that concept he had encountered in 9 realms and beyond, and that the Asgardian response to beings like that was not containment and not recruitment, but something closer to acknowledgement, a formal recognition that the being existed, and that the world was organized differently because of it, and that the organization was not necessarily worse. He said this with the particular Asgardian quality of someone making peace with something rather than resolving it, which was different from what Tony was doing with his diplomatic models, and different from what Fury was doing with his revised institutional frameworks, but was equally real and perhaps more honest. Saitama spent the weeks that followed in a pattern that had established itself and showed no signs of changing. He ran his 10 kilometers. He did his push-ups and sit-ups and squats. He bought groceries from a different store because the first one was under reconstruction, a fact that he had noted and felt genuinely bad about in the specific way. He felt genuinely bad about collateral damage, which was quietly and practically. He had left a note with Steve about contributing to the rebuild, and Steve had arranged it without making it a thing, because making it a thing would have embarrassed Saitama, and Saitama's discomfort with gratitude ran in both directions. He watched his nature documentaries. He went to bed at 9:15, when things happened that required him, and things happened because the world was the world and the world did not stop producing things that required someone. He showed up. He stopped them. He went back to his nature documentary, or his grocery list, or his push-ups, and he did not ask for acknowledgement, and he did not receive credit in any official form, because the official forms were still being designed by people who were still building the vocabulary for what he was. The Silver Surfer visited twice more. The second visit they sparred again longer, in a location over the Pacific that Tony had identified as having sufficient depth below the waterline to absorb the seismic consequences without coastal impact. The surfer came away from both sessions with a quality in his expression that those who knew him well identified as the specific look of someone whose understanding of the universe had been genuinely enlarged, which for a being of his experience and age was not a common look and was worth noting. He said to Tony, on the second visit, that he thought Galactus would honor the reclassification indefinitely. He said the universe had a way of organizing itself around genuine anomalies, not protecting them exactly, but orienting toward them the way a magnetic field orients toward a source, because anomalies at sufficient scale became reference points for the system around them rather than deviations from it. He said Saitama had become a reference point. Tony asked, "For what?" The surfer thought about this for a moment and said, "For the question of what's possible." He said it and did not elaborate, and did not need to, because the elaboration was everything that had happened in the preceding weeks and everything that was going to happen in the months ahead, and all of it pointed at the same thing, which was a bald man in a yellow cape who had found, in an alternate universe he had not chosen to visit, something that his own world had never fully provided, a place where things were hard enough, complicated enough, scaled enough. That his full attention was occasionally required. Not often. Most things did not require his full attention, but occasionally. And occasionally was enough, had always been enough. For Saitama, who had trained past the point where anything felt real, occasional was a word that carried the weight of everything he had been looking for. And finding it here, in this world, in this city, in this pattern of groceries and push-ups and nature documentaries, and the moments when the world needed something it didn't have except for him, was not a resolution, and was not a homecoming, and was not any of the narrative shapes that endings usually take. It was simply a fact, settled and real, the way a crater is real, and the way a compressed circle of concrete is real, the fact of something having arrived and decided, in its quiet and unceremonious way, to stay. The world did not return to normal. It became something else instead. And that something else was beginning.